August 480 BC. King Leonidas of Sparta stood at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, watching the largest army the world had ever seen approach from the north. Behind him, just 300 Spartan warriors, all men with living sons, carefully chosen so their family lines would continue after the inevitable end. Before him, perhaps 200,000 Persians, the combined might of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India. The Persian king Xerxes sent a herald with a simple demand: lay down your weapons. Leonidas's response would echo through history. Molon Labe, come and take them. For 3 days, these 300 men would hold the pass, buying time for Greece to prepare its defense. Their sacrifice would save Western civilization itself. This is the story of how that moment came to be, and what followed after. The story of ancient Greece begins not with Spartans or Athenians, but on an island in the Aegean Sea where Europe's first advanced civilization emerged around 2,700 years before Christ. On Crete, a sophisticated maritime culture developed that archaeologists call Minoan after the legendary King Minos. These weren't simple farmers living in mud huts. These were people building multi-story palace complexes with running water, elaborate art, and writing systems that we still can't fully decipher. By 2000 BC, massive palaces had risen at sites like Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros, each serving as the administrative, religious, and economic center for its territory. The palace at Knossos, eventually covering over 20,000 square meters, exemplified Minoan architectural sophistication. Its multi-story buildings contained hundreds of rooms connected by corridors, staircases, and light wells that brought natural illumination deep into the structure. Storage magazines lined with enormous pithoi, ceramic jars taller than a person, held olive oil, wine, grain, and other commodities. The famous throne room with its griffin frescoes and gypsum throne demonstrated the ceremonial importance of these complexes. Advanced engineering included sophisticated drainage systems with clay pipes carrying water and waste throughout the buildings. This wasn't primitive, this was Bronze Age high technology. The Minoans had created something unprecedented in Europe, urban civilization with all its complexity, wealth, and sophistication. But while Crete flourished peacefully, something very different was developing on the Greek mainland. Around 2000 BC, Indo-European speaking peoples began settling in southern Greece, bringing with them new technologies, social structures, and languages that would eventually evolve into ancient Greek. These newcomers, whom we call Mycenaeans after their principal site at Mycenae, initially lived in small agricultural communities, but they were fundamentally different from their Minoan contemporaries, where Minoan culture emphasized trade, artistic refinement, and apparent peaceful coexistence. Mycenaean society centered around warrior elites who ruled from heavily fortified citadels. These were people who understood power and they weren't afraid to use it. By 1600 BC, wealthy burial goods in shaft graves at Mycenae revealed a stratified society with a powerful aristocratic class. Gold death masks, bronze weapons decorated with intricate inlays, and jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship demonstrated both the wealth and martial values of Mycenaean elites. The famous gold mask discovered by Heinrich Schliemann, which he dramatically claimed belonged to Agamemnon, actually predates the legendary Trojan War by several centuries. Nevertheless, it exemplifies the sophisticated metalwork techniques and social stratification characteristic of early Mycenaean culture. Warriors were buried with bronze swords featuring elaborate hilts, boar's tusk helmets, and figure-8 shields that appear frequently in later Homeric descriptions of heroic warfare. Mycenaean settlements grew increasingly fortified as the civilization matured. The massive walls at Mycenae, Tiryns, and other sites employed Cyclopean masonry, enormous limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. Later Greeks, unable to imagine how mortals could have moved such massive stones, attributed these constructions to the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of mythology. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its triangular relief sculpture of two lions flanking a column, served both as defensive architecture and symbolic statement of royal power. These fortifications weren't decorative, they were serious military installations built by people who expected to fight and expected to be attacked. Palace complexes within these fortifications, while smaller than their Minoan counterparts, served similar administrative functions. The Megaron, a rectangular hall with central hearth and 4 columns supporting the roof, became the architectural signature of Mycenaean royal residences. These structures, with their formal throne rooms and adjacent administrative quarters, established patterns that would influence later Greek architectural traditions. But the Mycenaeans' most important innovation was linguistic. They adopted and adapted writing from the Minoans, developing their own script that would eventually reveal secrets the Bronze Age had kept hidden for over 3,000 years. The Mycenaeans adopted Linear A script from the Minoans and developed their own writing system called Linear B. Unlike its predecessor, Linear B was successfully deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, revealing it recorded an early form of Greek language. The tablets, primarily found at Pylos, Knossos, and other palace sites, contain detailed administrative records covering land tenure, taxation, religious offerings, and military organization. These aren't great literature or philosophy, they're inventories, tax records, bureaucratic documents, but they tell us everything about how Bronze Age Greeks actually lived and organized their society. The tablets reveal a complex feudal system with the one-axe, the king, at its apex, supported by a hierarchy of officials including the laureates and various local governors. They catalogue everything from chariot inventories to perfumed oil production, revealing a sophisticated palace economy that controlled agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade relationships across the Aegean. Military organization features prominently, reflecting Mycenaean society's warrior ethos. Tablets list bronzesmiths producing weapons, leather workers crafting armor, and chariot builders constructing the horse-drawn vehicles that dominated Bronze Age warfare. The Mycenaeans were bureaucratic warriors. They fought constantly, but they documented everything meticulously. Mycenaean expansion across the Aegean accelerated during the 15th century BC. They established settlements on numerous islands, including Rhodes and Kos, and eventually Crete itself. The presence of Linear B tablets at Knossos indicates Mycenaean control over the former Minoan capital by 1450 BC, though the exact circumstances of this takeover remain debated. Some scholars propose military conquest, while others suggest gradual infiltration through trade relationships and intermarriage. Either way, by the mid-15th century, the Mycenaeans had absorbed Minoan civilization, creating a distinctive late Bronze Age Aegean culture. The integration of Minoan and Mycenaean cultural elements created something unprecedented, a synthesis of peaceful Minoan artistic traditions with Mycenaean military organization. Mycenaean pottery incorporated Minoan decorative motifs, while Minoan artistic techniques influenced Mycenaean fresco painting and metalwork. Religious practices blended traditions, with Linear B tablets recording offerings to deities whose names would later appear in classical Greek mythology: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena. Trade networks established by the Minoans expanded under Mycenaean control to encompass the entire eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean pottery appears in archaeological contexts from southern Italy to the Levantine coast. This was the Bronze Age at its peak, prosperous, sophisticated, interconnected. Nothing could stop these palace civilizations, except everything was about to collapse. Around 1200 BC, catastrophic destruction would strike virtually every major center simultaneously. The Bronze Age was ending, and nobody knows exactly why. Around 1200 BC, catastrophic destruction struck virtually every major Mycenaean center simultaneously. Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, and numerous other sites show clear evidence of violent destruction, with palace buildings burned and administrative systems collapsed. The Linear B script disappeared entirely along with the complex administrative machinery it had served. Its widespread collapse marked the end of Bronze Age civilization in the Aegean and initiated the period known as the Greek Dark Ages. The causes remain hotly debated among scholars. Contemporary Egyptian and Hittite sources describe attacks by groups they called the Sea Peoples, maritime raiders who disrupted trade routes and attacked coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But were they the cause, or just another symptom of a larger collapse? The catastrophic events initiated one of the most dramatic demographic collapses in Mediterranean history. Archaeological surveys across Greece reveal a staggering reduction in settlement numbers, with some regions experiencing population declines of up to 90%. The fertile Argolid, which had supported numerous thriving communities during the Mycenaean period, retained only a handful of small villages scattered across its plains. In Messenia, the area around the destroyed palace of Pylos became virtually uninhabited. This wasn't just political collapse, this was near extinction. The complex social hierarchies that had characterized Mycenaean society vanished entirely, replaced by small, kinship-based groups struggling for survival in an increasingly fragmented landscape. The warrior elites who had dominated Bronze Age politics disappeared, taking with them the sophisticated administrative systems, specialized crafts, and long-distance trade networks that had sustained palace civilization. Without centralized authority to maintain them, the massive fortification walls at sites like Mycenae and Tiryns gradually crumbled, their cyclopean stones becoming quarries for later builders who lacked the organizational capacity to construct on such scales. The loss of literacy represented perhaps the most profound break with the Bronze Age past. Linear B script, which had recorded the complex administrative transactions of palace bureaucracies, vanished completely from the archaeological record after 1200 BC. The scribes who had maintained these archives either perished in the destructions or found their specialized skills irrelevant in the simplified societies that emerged from the collapse. For nearly 4 centuries, Greece would remain entirely pre-literate, with oral tradition becoming the sole means of preserving cultural memory and transmitting knowledge across generations. Picture it, an entire civilization forgetting how to write, forgetting how to build palaces, forgetting how to make bronze weapons and elaborate jewelry, everything simplified, everything reduced. The Greeks had fallen from Bronze Age sophistication into something approaching Stone Age simplicity. But they would rise again. It would just take 400 years. Material culture reflected this dramatic simplification. The elaborate pottery styles that had characterized late Mycenaean civilization gave way to crude, handmade vessels with minimal decoration. The sophisticated bronze work techniques that had produced intricate weapons and ornaments were largely forgotten, forcing communities to rely on simpler iron implements as that technology gradually spread westward from Anatolia. Monumental architecture disappeared entirely, with even the largest Dark Age settlements consisting of simple oval or apsidal houses built from field stones and mud brick. Trade networks that had once connected the Aegean to Egypt, the Levant, and the Western Mediterranean contracted to purely local exchanges. Yet even in these reduced circumstances, certain elements of Bronze Age culture persisted in modified forms. Religious practices continued at some traditional sanctuary sites, though on much smaller scales and with simpler ritual equipment. The cult of Zeus at Olympia maintained continuity through the Dark Ages, as evidenced by votive offerings found in stratified deposits spanning the transition period. Similarly, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi retained its sacred character, though the elaborate Bronze Age installations gave way to modest shrines tended by local communities. The gods survived even when palaces didn't, because people needed something to believe in during centuries of hardship. The gradual recovery that began around 900 BC manifested first in subtle archaeological indicators before becoming clearly visible in the material record. Settlement surveys show a slow but steady increase in site numbers across many regions of Greece, with new communities establishing themselves in previously abandoned territories. The pottery record reveals improving technical skills, with wheel-made vessels gradually replacing hand-built ceramics, and decorative schemes becoming more sophisticated. Population growth accelerated during the 9th century BC, driven partly by agricultural innovations and partly by the gradual restoration of security that allowed communities to expand beyond easily defensible locations. But the introduction of iron technology, while initially representing a step backward from Bronze Age metallurgical sophistication, ultimately provided access to more abundant raw materials than the copper and tin required for bronze production. Iron ore deposits scattered throughout Greece enabled local communities to produce their own tools and weapons without relying on long-distance trade networks. The revival of maritime activity marked a crucial turning point in Greece's emergence from the Dark Ages. Communities along the Aegean coastline began venturing beyond local waters, initially for fishing and small-scale trading, but gradually extending their range to include longer voyages. By the 8th century BC, renewed contact with communities in Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant showed pottery styles and decorative motifs beginning to reflect these renewed cultural exchanges. The Greeks were waking up, and they were about to discover something that would change everything: alphabetic writing borrowed from Phoenician traders. The adoption of alphabetic writing from Phoenician traders around 750 BC represents one of the most significant developments of the recovery period. Unlike Linear B, which had been restricted to palace scribes and administrative functions, the new alphabet proved remarkably adaptable to Greek linguistic needs and could be learned by individuals outside specialized bureaucratic contexts. The earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions, dating to around 750 BC, appear on pottery vessels and personal objects, suggesting that literacy spread initially through informal channels rather than institutional frameworks. This was revolutionary. Writing was no longer the exclusive tool of palace bureaucrats. Anyone could learn it. Anyone could use it. This alphabetic revolution had profound implications for cultural transmission and preservation. For the first time since the Bronze Age collapse, Greeks possessed a writing system capable of recording not just administrative data, but also literary, religious, and historical material. The flexibility of alphabetic script made it particularly suitable for recording the complex metrical patterns of oral poetry, enabling the preservation of traditional songs and stories that had previously existed only in the memories of performers. And the greatest of these oral traditions, the stories of the Trojan War and Odysseus's wanderings, were about to be written down for the first time. The composition and transmission of the Homeric epics during this period represents the culmination of centuries of oral poetic tradition. The Iliad and Odyssey, while set in a heroic Bronze Age past, actually preserve cultural memories spanning the entire Dark Age period, combining authentic Bronze Age details with later innovations in a complex literary synthesis. Archaeological discoveries have confirmed the accuracy of many Homeric descriptions of Bronze Age material culture, including the boar's tusk helmet found in Mycenaean contexts, and the massive silver-studded swords that appear in Linear B inventories. Homer got details right that he had no way of knowing, because the oral tradition had preserved them across 4 centuries. Yet the epics also contain numerous anachronisms that reflect Dark Age and early Archaic period realities. The political structures described in Homer, with their emphasis on warrior assemblies and personal loyalty bonds between leaders and followers, more closely resemble Dark Age social organization than the complex bureaucratic hierarchies documented in Linear B tablets. The oral poets who shaped these traditions, known as oidoi or rhapsodes, played crucial roles in preserving and transmitting cultural memory across the Dark Ages. These professional performers memorized vast repertoires of traditional stories, genealogies, and religious lore, adapting their material to suit different audiences while maintaining essential narrative frameworks. They were living libraries, walking encyclopedias, the keepers of Greek cultural identity during centuries when nothing was written down. And their formulaic language, repeated epithets, standard scenes, conventional phrases, served as mnemonic devices that enabled accurate transmission across generations. The religious developments of this period established many of the fundamental characteristics of later Greek religion, the anthropomorphic conception of deities that would dominate classical Greek religious thought emerged during the Dark Ages through the synthesis of Bronze Age divine traditions with newer theological concepts. The Olympian pantheon, while including deities whose names appear in Linear B tablets, acquired its characteristic family relationships and personality traits during the post-palatial period. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, they all appear in Bronze Age records, but their personalities, their stories, their complex family dramas all developed during the centuries when Greece was rebuilding. Major sanctuary sites began developing the architectural and institutional frameworks that would support the great religious festivals of the archaic and classical periods. At Olympia, the earliest temple of Hera dates to around 800 BC, marking the beginning of monumental religious architecture in post-Bronze Age Greece. The building, constructed using local limestone and wooden columns, established architectural principles that would influence temple design for centuries. The establishment of regular athletic competitions at Olympia, traditionally dated to 776 BC, reflected broader social and religious developments occurring throughout Greece during this period. These games served multiple functions beyond simple athletic competition, providing opportunities for communities scattered across the Greek world to maintain contact, exchange information, and demonstrate their prosperity and military capabilities. The prize system, which awarded only symbolic olive wreaths rather than material rewards, emphasized honor and prestige over economic incentives, reflecting the aristocratic values that were emerging as dominant social forces. If you won at Olympia, you didn't get rich, you got glory. And in Greek culture, glory was worth far more than gold. Similar developments occurred at other major sanctuary sites across Greece. Delphi began developing its characteristic oracular practices during the 8th century BC, with the Pythia delivering prophetic pronouncements that guided communities facing difficult decisions about colonization, warfare, and internal governance. The sanctuary's location on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, with its dramatic geological features, including the famous chasm from which intoxicating vapors allegedly emerged, provided an appropriately awesome setting for divine communication. When Greeks faced impossible decisions, they went to Delphi. The oracle's cryptic pronouncements, always ambiguous, always open to interpretation, somehow managed to guide Greek civilization through its most critical moments. Whether through genuine divine inspiration or brilliant political manipulation, Delphi became the spiritual center of the Greek world. And as Greeks reconnected with each other through sanctuaries and festivals, they began reconnecting with the wider Mediterranean through something far more ambitious: colonization. The great colonization movement that began around 750 BC represented a coordinated response to demographic and economic pressures. Unlike the random migrations that had characterized earlier periods, Greek colonization followed systematic patterns designed to establish permanent settlements that would maintain connections with their founding cities. Each colonial expedition received official sanction from its mother city, along with carefully selected leadership, religious sanction from major oracles, and predetermined objectives for territorial acquisition and economic development. This wasn't desperate refugees fleeing. This was organized expansion, carefully planned and systematically executed. Chalcis on the island of Euboea pioneered many of these colonization techniques, establishing settlements along the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily that became models for later colonial foundations. The Euboean settlement at Cumae, founded around 740 BC near modern Naples, created the first permanent Greek presence in the western Mediterranean. The colonists selected this site for its excellent natural harbour, fertile agricultural hinterland, and strategic position controlling access to central Italy's metal resources. Within a generation, Cumae had established its own trading networks with indigenous Italian communities and begun founding subsidiary settlements along the surrounding coastline. The success of these early Euboean colonies encouraged other Greek cities to organize their own overseas expeditions. Corinth, strategically positioned on the narrow isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece, leveraged its location to become one of the most active colonizing powers. Around 733 BC, Corinthian colonists established Syracuse on the eastern coast of Sicily, selecting a site that combined an excellent natural harbour with access to the island's fertile interior plains. The settlement's position on the large island of Ortygia, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway, provided natural defences that enabled the colonists to establish secure control over their new territory. Syracuse quickly developed into one of the most prosperous and powerful Greek cities in the western Mediterranean. The colony's agricultural territories, worked by indigenous populations reduced to serf-like status, produced grain surpluses that supported rapid population growth and urban development. Syracuse craftsmen developed distinctive pottery styles and metalworking techniques that combined Greek traditions with local innovations, creating products that found markets throughout the Mediterranean. The city's strategic location made it a natural hub for trade between Greece proper and the western colonies, generating additional wealth through commercial activities. Other Greek cities followed Corinth's example with their own Sicilian foundations. Megara established Megara Hyblaea, while various Rhodian and Cretan communities founded Gela. And these colonies often came into conflict with each other as they expanded their territories and competed for control over indigenous populations and resources. The western Mediterranean was becoming a new Greek world, but one where Greeks fought Greeks as often as they fought barbarians. The colonization movement extended beyond Sicily to encompass the entire Mediterranean basin. Greek settlements appeared along the coast of southern Italy, earning the region the name Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. Cities like Sybaris, Croton, and Tarentum established control over extensive territories and accumulated enormous wealth through agricultural production and trade. Sybaris, founded by Achaean colonists around 720 BC, became legendary for its prosperity and luxury, controlling territory that extended across the Italian peninsula from the Ionian to the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Sybarites lived so well that their name became synonymous with extravagant living. A Sybaritic lifestyle meant unrestrained luxury and pleasure. The northern shores of the Black Sea attracted Greek colonists seeking access to the grain, fish, and raw materials produced by the Scythian populations of the region. Miletus, the great Ionian commercial city, established dozens of colonies along the Black Sea coastline, including major settlements at Sinope, Trapezus, and Tanais. These foundations created a network of Greek trading posts that channeled Scythian wheat, honey, wax, furs, and slaves to markets throughout the Greek world. The grain imports from these Black Sea colonies became essential for supporting the growing populations of cities like Athens, which lacked sufficient agricultural territory to feed their citizens. Greek expansion also reached the western Mediterranean, where colonists established settlements along the coasts of modern France and Spain. The Phocian foundation of Massalia around 600 BC created the first permanent Greek presence in the western Mediterranean beyond the Italian peninsula. The colonists selected this site at the mouth of the Rhone River for its excellent natural harbour and access to the trade routes that connected the Mediterranean with the interior regions of Gaul. Massalia's merchants established trading relationships with Celtic populations throughout southern France, exchanging Greek wine, pottery, and manufactured goods for raw materials including metals, amber, and agricultural products. The wealth and cultural sophistication that these colonial foundations brought to the Greek world accelerated political developments within the mother cities. The profits from colonial trade and the military experience gained through overseas expansion strengthened the hoplite class while creating new opportunities for individual advancement outside traditional aristocratic channels. Successful merchants and craftsmen could now accumulate wealth that rivaled that of established noble families, while military service and colonial expeditions provided paths to political prominence for ambitious young men. These social changes created increasing tensions within the traditional political structures of the emerging polis. Aristocratic families who had dominated Dark Age communities found their authority challenged by newly wealthy merchants and the organized political demands of the hoplite class. The resulting conflicts would transform the political landscape of the Greek world, and nowhere more dramatically than in Athens and Sparta. Athens provides the clearest example of how these tensions played out in constitutional terms. During the 7th century BC, the city experienced severe social conflicts between the established aristocratic families and the broader citizen body. The crisis reached its peak around 630 BC when a young aristocrat named Cylon attempted to establish himself as tyrant with support from his father-in-law, the tyrant of Megara. The coup attempt failed, but the violent suppression of his followers created a religious pollution that haunted Athenian politics for generations. The incident demonstrated both the fragility of traditional aristocratic authority and the potential for ambitious individuals to exploit social tensions. In response, the Athenians commissioned Draco to codify their laws around 621 BC. This represented the first attempt by a Greek community to establish written legal standards that would apply equally to all citizens regardless of their social status. Draco's laws, inscribed on wooden tablets and displayed in public spaces, covered everything from property disputes to homicide cases. The code's severity, which prescribed death for most offences, gave rise to the term draconian for excessively harsh legal measures. But harsh or not, written law was revolutionary. For the first time, citizens could predict the consequences of their actions and challenge judicial decisions that appeared to violate established procedures. However, Draco's legal reforms failed to address the underlying economic issues that created social tension within Athenian society. Many small farmers had fallen into debt to wealthy landowners, often being forced to mortgage their land or even their personal freedom to secure loans. When harvests failed or market conditions deteriorated, these debtors faced the loss of their property and reduction to slavery. The resulting concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few wealthy families threatened to create a permanent class of landless poor who would be excluded from the political and military participation that defined citizenship. The appointment of Solon as archon around 594 BC marked a more comprehensive attempt to resolve these structural problems through constitutional reform. Solon, himself a member of the aristocratic class but known for his moderate views and poetic wisdom, received extraordinary powers to restructure Athenian society and government. His reforms, known collectively as the seisachtheia, the shaking off of burdens, addressed both immediate economic grievances and long-term political organization. He cancelled all debt secured by land or personal freedom, immediately freeing Athenian citizens who had been reduced to slavery through economic hardship. He also prohibited future loans that used the borrower's person as collateral, preventing the re-emergence of debt slavery. But more importantly, he transformed Athenian politics by replacing aristocratic privilege with a new system based on wealth rather than birth. The revolution had begun. Athens would never be the same. Solon replaced the traditional system of aristocratic privilege with a new classification based on wealth, dividing Athenian citizens into 4 classes according to their annual agricultural production. The wealthiest citizens, producing 500 measures of grain or equivalent value in other products, formed the pentakosiomedimnoi class and remained eligible for the highest offices. The hippes class, producing 300 measures and capable of maintaining a horse for military service, could hold lower magistracies. The zeugitai, producing 200 measures and serving as hoplites, gained access to minor offices and full participation in the citizen assembly. Even the thetes, the poorest citizens who served as light infantry or rowers, received the right to participate in the assembly and serve on juries. This system, while still favouring the wealthy, represented a dramatic departure from purely aristocratic governance by making political participation dependent on economic contribution rather than birth. Successful merchants and craftsmen could now advance to the highest levels of political authority if they accumulated sufficient wealth, while even poor citizens retained meaningful roles in the political process. The creation of the Heliaia, a popular court where large juries of citizens decided major legal cases, further democratized the judicial system by removing the exclusive authority of aristocratic magistrates. Solon had cracked open the door to democracy, but it would take another century and a lot more bloodshed before that door opened fully. While Athens experimented with constitutional reforms that gradually expanded political participation, Sparta took a radically different path. Situated in the fertile Eurotas Valley of Laconia, Sparta created a social and political system so distinctive that it would fascinate and horrify other Greeks for centuries. Unlike the commercial city-states that embraced trade and cultural exchange, Sparta deliberately isolated itself from outside influences to maintain a militaristic society designed around a single, overriding purpose: the control and suppression of a massive enslaved population that outnumbered its citizen masters by perhaps 7 to 1. The origins of this extraordinary system lay in Sparta's early expansion during the 8th century BC. Around 740 BC, facing the same population pressures that drove other Greek communities toward overseas colonization, the Spartans chose instead to expand into neighboring territories within the Peloponnese itself. Their first major target was Messenia, the fertile region west of Mount Taygetus that contained some of the richest agricultural land in southern Greece. The First Messenian War, lasting approximately 20 years, resulted in the complete subjugation of the Messenian population. Unlike typical Greek warfare, which aimed at limited territorial gains or tribute payments, the Spartan conquest involved the systematic enslavement of the entire defeated population. The Messenians became helots, captives, bound to work the land for their Spartan masters while retaining no political rights or personal freedom. This created a demographic nightmare that would define Sparta forever. This massive influx of enslaved agricultural workers freed Spartan citizens from the necessity of farming their own land, enabling them to devote their entire lives to military training and political affairs. But the scale of this helot population created an unprecedented security challenge. Archaeological surveys suggest that the combined helot populations of Laconia and Messenia may have reached 200,000 individuals, while the Spartan citizen body probably never exceeded 10,000 adult males, even at its peak. This demographic imbalance meant that Spartans lived in constant fear of helot rebellion, requiring the development of institutions and practices designed to maintain control through systematic intimidation and surveillance. The Spartan response involved the creation of a social system that that subordinated every aspect of individual life to collective security needs. The traditional Greek emphasis on personal achievement and individual excellence gave way to rigid conformity and group discipline. Private wealth accumulation, which drove political development in other poleis, was actively discouraged through regulations that limited luxury consumption and prohibited the use of gold or silver currency. Instead, Spartans used unwieldy iron bars as their medium of exchange, making commercial transactions so cumbersome that trade with other communities became virtually impossible. This wasn't just economic policy, this was social engineering designed to create perfect warriors. The institutional framework that emerged centered around a unique form of dual monarchy that balanced royal authority against collective citizen control. Two kings from separate hereditary dynasties, the Agiads and Eurypontids, shared executive power while serving as high priests and military commanders. This arrangement prevented the concentration of authority in a single individual while ensuring continuity of leadership through hereditary succession. But the real power lay with the ephors, 5 elected magistrates who could investigate and punish any citizen behavior that threatened the established order, including the power to arrest and try even the kings themselves. The citizen assembly, called the Apella, included all Spartan males over 30 who had completed their military training and continued to participate in the communal dining system that reinforced social solidarity. Unlike Athenian democratic assemblies, where citizens engaged in open debate before voting, the Spartan Apella operated through acclamation, with the loudest shouts determining the outcome of proposed measures. And this system discouraged individual oratory and political maneuvering while emphasizing collective unity and traditional consensus. The Gerousia, a council of 28 men over 60, plus the 2 kings, prepared business for the assembly and served as the highest court for serious criminal cases. These gerontes held their positions for life, creating a conservative body that resisted rapid changes to established practices. But the most terrifying Spartan institution wasn't political, it was educational. The Agog's training system would transform boys into the most feared warriors in Greece, and it started at age 7. The Agocha, Sparta's mandatory training program for male citizens, began at age 7 when boys were removed from their families and organized into groups under the supervision of older youths and adult instructors. This educational system aimed not at intellectual development or artistic achievement, but at creating warriors capable of absolute obedience, physical endurance, and ruthless efficiency in combat. The physical environment of Agogi training deliberately emphasized hardship and deprivation to toughen boys for adult military service. Participants received minimal food, requiring them to supplement their rations through theft, which was encouraged as long as they avoided detection. Those caught stealing faced severe punishment, not for the theft itself, but for the incompetence of being discovered. Clothing remained minimal regardless of weather conditions, with boys wearing simple tunics year-round and going barefoot even in winter. Sleeping accommodations consisted of reed mats in unheated dormitories, forcing participants to adapt to discomfort that would prepare them for campaign conditions. Combat training began with wrestling, boxing, and other individual fighting skills before progressing to coordinated group exercises that emphasized unit cohesion and tactical discipline. Boys learned to fight in the close-order phalanx formation that would dominate their adult military careers, practicing the precise movements and mutual dependence that made this tactical system so effective. The psychological aspects of Agoge training proved equally important in shaping Spartan character and values. Boys learned absolute obedience to authority through harsh punishment for any sign of disobedience or individual initiative. They were encouraged to inform on each other's violations of regulations, creating a surveillance system that would continue into adult life. Emotional expression, particularly any display of fear or pain, was ruthlessly suppressed through ridicule and punishment. The famous Spartan laconic speech pattern, characterized by brevity and understatement, developed from this emphasis on emotional control and disdain for elaborate rhetoric. At age 20, successful participants in the agog became eligible for selection into one of the elite military units that formed the core of Spartan fighting strength. The most prestigious was the Royal Bodyguard, composed of 300 men chosen for their exceptional skill and absolute loyalty. These hippes, despite their name meaning horsemen, fought on foot as the elite infantry formation that led Spartan armies into battle. Selection for this unit represented the pinnacle of military achievement and virtually guaranteed future political prominence within Spartan society. Full citizenship required additional qualifications beyond successful completion of military training. Candidates needed election to one of the syssitia, the communal dining groups that formed the basic units of Spartan social organization. These mess groups, typically consisting of 15 men who had served together in military campaigns, controlled admission through unanimous consent of existing members. The system ensured that only individuals who had demonstrated absolute reliability and conformity to Spartan values could achieve full citizenship status. By 30, you were either a full Spartiate, a warrior citizen of the most feared military state in Greece, or you were nothing. While Sparta perfected its militaristic society through deliberate isolation, Athens embarked on a radically different path. The constitutional reforms initiated by Solon had addressed immediate economic grievances while establishing the principle that political participation should depend on contribution rather than birth. But they failed to resolve the underlying tensions between traditional aristocratic authority and the growing political consciousness of the broader citizen body. The decades following Solon's archonship witnessed increasing polarization between competing factions that threatened to tear Athenian society apart through civil warfare. The crisis deepened during the 560s BC when Pisistratus, a charismatic aristocrat with military experience from successful campaigns against Megara, exploited these factional divisions to establish himself as tyrant of Athens. Unlike the negative connotations that the term tyrant would later acquire, Greek tyranny in this period represented a specific form of unconstitutional rule by individuals who seized power through popular support rather than hereditary succession or legal appointment. Pisistratus appealed directly to the rural poor and urban craftsmen who felt excluded from political arrangements that favored established aristocratic families, promising land redistribution and public works projects that would provide employment and economic opportunity. The Pisistratid tyranny, which lasted with brief interruptions until 510 BC, demonstrated both the potential benefits and inherent dangers of personal rule within the polis system. Pisistratus and his sons Hippias and Hipparchus transformed Athens from a relatively minor agricultural community into a major cultural and economic center that rivaled Corinth and the wealthy cities of Ionia. They commissioned elaborate public building projects, including new temples and fountain houses that provided clean water throughout the city. The Great Panathenaea, Athens's premier religious festival, expanded under their patronage to include dramatic performances, athletic competitions, and artistic displays that attracted visitors from across the Greek world. The tyrants also promoted economic development through policies that supported small farmers and encouraged craft production for export markets. And the famous black figure pottery produced by Athenian workshops during this period achieved wide distribution throughout the Mediterranean, competing successfully with Corinthian products that had previously dominated luxury ceramic markets. These economic policies created prosperity that extended beyond the traditional aristocratic elite to include substantial portions of the citizen population. But as the initial enthusiasm for Pisistratid reforms faded, their rule became increasingly dependent on foreign support and domestic surveillance. Hippias, who assumed power after his father's death in 527 BC, grew progressively more suspicious and repressive, particularly after his brother Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BC in a personal dispute that later mythology transformed into heroic resistance to tyranny. The expulsion of Hippias in 510 BC, accomplished through Spartan military intervention, created a power vacuum that different factions attempted to fill, and one man's solution would change not just Athens, but the entire concept of government forever. The expulsion of Hippias in 510 BC created a power vacuum that Isagoras and Cleisthenes competed to fill through competing constitutional proposals. Isagoras, representing traditional aristocratic interests, sought to restore the pre-tyrannical system that had concentrated authority in the hands of established families. His rival, Cleisthenes, despite his own aristocratic background as a member of the prominent Alcmaeonid family, proposed instead a radical restructuring of Athenian political organization that would permanently break the power of traditional kinship groups while extending meaningful political participation to the entire citizen body. The stakes couldn't have been higher. This wasn't just about who ruled Athens, but about what Athens would become. The constitutional revolution that Cleisthenes implemented around 508 BC created the institutional foundations of Athenian democracy while establishing principles of political organization that would influence constitutional development throughout the ancient world. His reforms began with a complete reorganization of the citizen body that replaced traditional tribal divisions based on kinship with new artificial tribes that mixed citizens from different geographical areas and social backgrounds. The four ancient tribes that had dominated Athenian politics since the Dark Ages gave way to 10 new tribes, each containing citizens from the city center, the coastal regions, and the inland agricultural areas. This tribal reorganization, known as the demi system, created 139 local political units called demes that served as the basic building blocks of Athenian political participation. Every citizen belonged to a dem based on his place of residence, and dem membership became hereditary regardless of subsequent changes in domicile. The dems functioned as local governments with their own assemblies, magistrates, and religious festivals, while also serving as the mechanism through which citizens participated in city-wide political institutions. Dem assemblies elected representatives to higher offices, maintained local military units, and managed community property and religious obligations. The principle of isonomia, political equality, that underlay these reforms represented a fundamental departure from previous Greek political thought, which had generally accepted hierarchy and differential privilege as natural features of social organization. Cleisthenes' system ensured that every citizen, regardless of wealth or family background, possessed identical political rights and opportunities for participation in governmental decisions. The random selection of many officials through lot rather than election prevented the emergence of professional political classes while ensuring that ordinary citizens regularly held administrative responsibilities. It was radical, unprecedented, revolutionary, and it worked. The Council of 500, perhaps the most innovative of Cleisthenes' institutional creations, exemplified these democratic principles through its composition and procedures. Each of the 10 tribes selected 50 representatives annually through lot from among citizens over 30 years of age, creating a body that genuinely reflected the social and economic diversity of the Athenian population. The council prepared business for the citizen assembly, supervised the execution of assembly decisions, and managed the routine administrative functions that kept the city operating effectively. Democracy wasn't just voting, it was ordinary citizens running the government on a daily basis. The institution of ostracism, implemented as a safeguard against the return of tyranny, demonstrated the sophisticated political thinking that characterized Cleisthenes' constitutional design. Each year, the Citizen Assembly could vote to exile any individual for 10 years without trial or confiscation of property, simply by writing his name on a pottery shard called an ostracon. This procedure required a minimum of 6,000 votes to take effect, ensuring that ostracism reflected genuine popular concern rather than factional manipulation. The temporary nature of the exile and the absence of other penalties meant that ostracized individuals could return to full citizenship after their term expired, preventing the permanent elimination of political opponents that had characterized earlier factional conflicts. These democratic innovations addressed political problems that affected Greek communities throughout the Mediterranean world. The growth of hoplite classes, the expansion of commercial activity, and the cultural contacts created by colonization had undermined traditional aristocratic authority everywhere, creating demands for broader political participation that existing institutions could not accommodate. Cleisthenes' solution provided a model for constitutional development that influenced political experimentation throughout the Greek world. But the real test was coming. Could these democratic institutions survive external military pressure while maintaining internal cohesion? The Persians were about to provide the answer. The Ionian Revolt of 499–494 BC had demonstrated Persian willingness to intervene directly in Greek affairs to suppress political arrangements that threatened imperial stability. When Athens provided limited naval support to the Ionian rebels, King Darius I of Persia decided that Athenian democracy represented a dangerous example that required elimination through military conquest. The Persian expedition of 490 BC, commanded by Artaphernes and Datis, aimed at the complete subjugation of Athens and the restoration of Hippias as a client tyrant under Persian oversight. The force that landed at Marathon included perhaps 25,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, supported by a fleet of 600 ships. And the Athenian response to this crisis demonstrated both the military effectiveness and political resilience that democratic institutions had created. The Citizen Assembly voted to mobilize the entire hoplite force of approximately 9,000 men under the command of 10 elected generals, including Miltiades, who possessed crucial knowledge of Persian military techniques from his earlier service in the Thracian Chersonese. The decision to march immediately to Marathon, despite the numerical disadvantage and the absence of Spartan support, reflected the confidence that democratic participation had instilled in the Athenian citizen body. They were free men defending their freedom, and that made all the difference. The battle that occurred on the Marathon Plain on September 12, 490 BC, became one of the most celebrated victories in Greek military history, not only for its tactical brilliance but for its demonstration that free citizens could defeat the professional armies of despotic empires. Miltiades deployed his forces in an unusually thin line that stretched across the entire width of the plain, preventing Persian cavalry from outflanking the Greek position. He deliberately weakened his center while strengthening the wings, creating a formation designed to envelop the Persian infantry once battle was joined. The Athenian charge across the mile-wide plain, conducted at full speed to minimize exposure to Persian archery, caught the enemy forces unprepared for the ferocity and coordination of the assault. The Persian center initially pushed back the weakened Greek middle, but the reinforced Athenian wings broke through their opponents and wheeled inward to attack the Persian rear. The resulting encirclement led to a complete Persian collapse, with approximately 6,400 enemy casualties compared to only 192 Athenian dead. The Persian fleet withdrew immediately, abandoning any attempt to continue the campaign against Athens. Those 192 Athenian dead, buried in a collective grave on the battlefield, became heroic symbols of democratic sacrifice that inspired subsequent generations of citizens to defend their constitutional system against external threats. The psychological impact of Marathon extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, transforming Athenian self-perception while demonstrating to the entire Greek world that Persian power was not invincible. The victory validated democratic institutions by proving that citizen soldiers motivated by defense of their political freedom could defeat professional armies fighting for imperial conquest. But the Persians weren't finished. Darius's son Xerxes would return with an army so large it would take 7 days just to cross the Hellespont. The storm was gathering, and when it broke, it would threaten to destroy everything the Greeks had built. The decade following Marathon witnessed unprecedented Athenian confidence that manifested in ambitious public projects and aggressive foreign policy initiatives. The discovery of rich silver deposits at Laurion in southeastern Attica provided the financial resources necessary for major military and architectural undertakings. Rather than distributing this windfall among the citizens as traditional practice would have suggested, the Athenians accepted the proposal of Themistocles to invest the silver revenues in naval construction that would transform Athens into the dominant maritime power in the Aegean Sea. The construction of 200 triremes between 483 and 480 BC represented the largest naval building program in Greek history. These vessels, powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers and equipped with bronze rams for attacking enemy ships, required extensive training and coordination to operate effectively. The Athenian decision to man these ships primarily with citizens from the Thetes class, who lacked the wealth necessary for hoplite service, further democratized military participation while creating new sources of political influence within the constitutional system. The poor were no longer just spectators in Athenian democracy, they were now the rowers who would save Athens from Persian conquest. The Persian invasion of 480 BC under Xerxes tested these naval preparations while presenting the Greek world with its greatest existential crisis since the Bronze Age collapse. The enormous Persian force, which ancient sources estimated at over 1 million men, though modern scholars suggest perhaps 200,000, represented the full military resources of the largest empire in world history. The construction of boat bridges across the Hellespont and the excavation of a canal through the Athos Peninsula demonstrated Persian engineering capabilities while emphasizing the unprecedented scale of their commitment to Greek conquest. This wasn't a raid, this wasn't a punitive expedition, this was total war aimed at the complete subjugation of Greece. And standing in their path at a narrow mountain pass were 300 Spartans under King Leonidas. The Greek response required unprecedented cooperation among communities that had traditionally viewed each other as rivals or enemies. The Hellenic League, organized around Spartan leadership but including Athens as a co-equal partner, represented the first successful attempt at pan-Greek political coordination since the legendary Trojan War. The League's decision to defend the narrow pass at Thermopylae while simultaneously positioning the combined Greek fleet at Artemisium demonstrated sophisticated strategic planning that maximized Greek advantages while minimizing Persian numerical superiority. Everything depended on holding that pass. Everything depended on Leonidas and his 300. The heroic sacrifice of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, along with 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans who chose to remain with them, became legendary throughout the ancient world as an example of free men's willingness to die rather than submit to despotic rule. The 3-day battle demonstrated both the tactical superiority of Greek heavy infantry and the limitations of courage when facing overwhelming numerical odds. Leonidas's reported response to Persian demands for surrender, "Come and take them," when asked to lay down Greek weapons, exemplified the defiant spirit that would characterize Greek resistance throughout the war. The Persian breakthrough at Thermopylae, achieved through betrayal when a local Greek named Ephialtes showed them a mountain path around the pass, forced the evacuation of Athens and created the crisis that would define Athenian democracy for generations. Themistocles convinced the citizen assembly to abandon the city entirely, trusting their survival to the wooden walls that the Delphic oracle had cryptically promised would save them. The evacuation of the entire Athenian population to the island of Salamis, while Persian forces occupied and burned Athens, represented an act of collective faith in democratic decision-making that few other political systems could have sustained. The naval battle at Salamis on September 23, 480 BC, vindicated this desperate strategy while dealing Persian naval power a blow from which it never recovered. Themistocles lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, where their numerical advantage became a liability as ships collided with each other in the confined waters. The Greek triremes, manned by experienced crews fighting for their homeland survival, systematically destroyed Persian vessels that could not maneuver effectively in the restricted space. Xerxes, watching the battle from a throne erected on the mainland shore, witnessed the destruction of perhaps 300 Persian ships while Greek losses remained minimal. The psychological impact of this defeat, occurring within sight of the Persian king himself, shattered the aura of invincibility that had sustained Persian expansion for decades. The withdrawal of Xerxes and a substantial portion of his army immediately after Salamis left his general Mardonius with insufficient forces to maintain control over occupied Greek territory. The final Persian defeat at Plataea in 479 BC, achieved through the combined efforts of the largest Greek army ever assembled, eliminated Persian power from European soil. But victory came with a price. Athens lay in ruins, burned by the Persians. The question was, what would the Athenians build from the ashes? But the aftermath of the Persian Wars created conditions that enabled Athens to transform from a regional power into the head of a maritime empire that would dominate the Aegean for over half a century. The formation of the Delian League in 478 BC, ostensibly organized to continue the war against Persia through coordinated naval operations, provided the institutional framework through which Athens gradually converted allied cities into tribute-paying subjects. The League's treasury, initially housed on the sacred island of Delos to emphasize its pan-Hellenic character, contained contributions from nearly 200 member cities that collectively provided Athens with resources exceeding those of any previous Greek state. The transformation of this defensive alliance into an instrument of Athenian imperialism occurred gradually through a series of precedents that established Athenian authority over League affairs. When Naxos attempted to withdraw from the League around 470 BC, Athens used military force to compel continued participation while converting the island from an independent ally into a tribute-paying subject. Similar interventions against Thasos and other cities established the principle that League membership was permanent and that Athens possessed ultimate authority over member cities' domestic and foreign policies. The alliance had become an empire, and Athens wasn't asking permission anymore. The transfer of the League treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 BC marked the formal acknowledgement of Athenian hegemony while providing the financial resources that would support the greatest cultural flowering in Greek history. The annual tribute of approximately 400 to 460 talents of silver, supplemented by revenues from Athenian-controlled mines and commercial activities, enabled public works projects and cultural patronage on a scale that dwarfed previous Greek achievements. The money that should have been fighting Persians was now building temples, paying for festivals, and creating the golden age of Athenian culture. The Periclean building program that began in the 440s BC transformed Athens into a showcase of architectural and artistic excellence that proclaimed Athenian cultural supremacy throughout the Mediterranean world. The construction of the Parthenon, begun in 447 BC under the supervision of the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, represented the culmination of Greek architectural achievement while serving as a powerful symbol of Athenian imperial power. The temple's Pentelic marble construction, with its subtle mathematical proportions and sophisticated optical corrections, created visual effects that made the building appear perfectly straight and symmetrical from every angle. The elaborate sculptural program, designed by Phidias and executed by teams of master craftsmen, depicted the mythological conflicts between civilization and barbarism that Athenians interpreted as allegories for their own struggle against Persian despotism. The massive chryselephantine statue of Athena Parthenos that dominated the temple's interior, standing nearly 40 feet tall and incorporating over 2,500 pounds of gold, demonstrated both Athenian wealth and religious devotion. The goddess's elaborate costume and attributes proclaimed Athens's military victories while emphasizing the divine protection that had enabled their success. The Parthenon still stands today, damaged, plundered, controversial, but still the most recognizable symbol of classical Greek achievement. But the golden age it represented was built on imperial exploitation. And that empire was about to face its greatest challenge from the one Greek power that refused to submit, Sparta. The magnificent cultural achievements that had transformed Athens into the intellectual and artistic center of the Greek world during the mid-5th century, BC rested upon an increasingly unstable foundation of imperial domination that generated mounting resentment throughout the Aegean. The Delian League's evolution from a defensive alliance into an Athenian empire had created a system of tribute extraction and political control that many Greeks viewed as inconsistent with the fundamental polis principle of autonomy. By 450 BC, Athens controlled approximately 150 subject cities whose annual tribute payments supported not only the Athenian navy but also the ambitious building programs and cultural patronage that made Athens the envy of the Greek world. This imperial system inevitably brought Athens into conflict with Sparta, whose own alliance network in the Peloponnese represented a fundamentally different approach to interstate relations. The Peloponnesian League, unlike Athens's maritime empire, preserved the formal independence of member cities while requiring their participation in Spartan-led military campaigns. Spartan hegemony rested on military supremacy rather than tribute extraction, allowing allied cities to maintain their traditional institutions and economic systems. Contrasting models of interstate organization reflected deeper ideological differences about the proper relationship between power and freedom that would ultimately prove irreconcilable. The underlying economic tensions between the two systems intensified during the 440s BC as Athenian commercial expansion began threatening traditional Spartan spheres of influence. Athenian merchants, protected by the empire's naval supremacy, established trading relationships throughout the Western Mediterranean that competed directly with Corinthian commerce. The Athenian colony at Thurii in southern Italy, founded in 444 BC with Pericles' active support, provided a base for further commercial penetration into regions that Corinth and other Peloponnesian cities had traditionally dominated. But these economic rivalries created powerful constituencies within the Spartan alliance that viewed Athenian expansion as an existential threat. The immediate causes of the war emerged from a series of local conflicts that escalated beyond their original scope because of the broader tensions between the two alliance systems. The dispute between Corinth and Corcyra over control of Epidamnus in 435 BC initially appeared to be a typical intercity conflict over colonial territories and trade routes. However, Corcyra's appeal to Athens for naval assistance against Corinthian intervention transformed a regional dispute into a confrontation between the major alliance systems. Athens's decision to provide limited naval support to Corcyra, while technically avoiding direct conflict with Corinth, demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining neutrality when every local dispute carried implications for the broader balance of power. The Potidæa crisis of 432 BC further escalated tensions by directly involving an Athenian subject city with strong ties to Corinth. When Athens demanded that Potidæa expel its Corinthian magistrates and dismantle its fortifications, the city's refusal led to a lengthy siege that required substantial Athenian military resources. The Megarian decree passed by the Athenian assembly around 432 BC represented perhaps the most provocative measure. This economic embargo excluded Megarian merchants from all ports controlled by Athens and its allies, effectively cutting off Megara's access to commercial networks that sustained its economy. War was coming. Everyone knew it. The only question was, who would strike first? The Spartan decision to declare war in 431 BC followed extensive deliberations that revealed deep divisions within the Peloponnesian League about the wisdom of challenging Athenian power. King Archidamus II, who would give his name to the war's first phase, argued for caution and diplomatic solutions that might resolve the crisis without the enormous costs and uncertain outcomes of prolonged warfare. His assessment of Athenian strengths, particularly their naval supremacy and financial resources, proved remarkably prescient in anticipating the challenges that Sparta would face. However, the Corinthian delegation's passionate appeals for immediate action against Athenian aggression ultimately swayed the Spartan assembly toward war. The strategic challenges facing both sides as warfare began in 431 BC reflected the fundamental asymmetries between land-based and maritime power that would shape the entire conflict. Sparta possessed clear superiority in hoplite warfare, with allied forces totaling perhaps 60,000 heavy infantry capable of devastating any territory they could reach by land. However, Athenian control of the sea enabled them to avoid decisive land battles while using their naval mobility to strike Spartan territories and allies at will. The famous long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus created an impregnable defensive system that allowed the city to maintain maritime communications even when Spartan forces occupied Attica. The Archidamian War's opening campaigns demonstrated both the effectiveness and limitations of these contrasting strategic approaches. The annual Spartan invasions of Attica, beginning in 431 BC, systematically devastated the countryside surrounding Athens, forcing the rural population to seek shelter within the city's fortifications. These operations aimed at breaking Athenian morale by destroying the agricultural foundation of their economy while demonstrating Spartan military superiority to wavering allies. The sight of smoke rising from burning farmsteads throughout Attica created intense psychological pressure on Athenian citizens who watched helplessly as their ancestral properties suffered destruction. Yet the Athenian strategy of avoiding land battles while conducting naval raids against Peloponnesian coastlines proved equally effective in demonstrating the futility of traditional military approaches against maritime power. Athenian naval expeditions struck targets throughout the Peloponnese, creating economic disruption, while forcing Sparta to disperse defensive forces along extensive coastlines. These raids, while individually limited in scope, demonstrated Athens's ability to project power throughout the Greek world, while remaining invulnerable to retaliation through conventional military means. For years, neither side could achieve decisive advantage. The Spartans burned farms, the Athenians raided coasts. Both sides bled slowly. But then disaster struck Athens, not from Spartan spears, but from something far more deadly: disease. The outbreak of plague in Athens during 430 BC fundamentally altered the war's trajectory, while revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in the Athenian defensive strategy. The disease, probably typhus or typhoid fever, spread rapidly through the overcrowded city where rural refugees had sought protection from Spartan invasions. Contemporary accounts describe horrific symptoms: high fever, severe headaches, bleeding from the mouth and nose, and painful skin lesions that often proved fatal within a week of onset. The plague's mortality rate, estimated at between 25 and 35% of the affected population, eliminated perhaps 75,000 Athenians, including many of the skilled craftsmen and experienced rowers who formed the backbone of Athenian military power. Pericles himself became a casualty, dying in 429 BC. Athens had lost its greatest leader just when it needed him most. The succession struggle that followed Pericles' death brought to prominence political figures whose approaches to warfare differed dramatically from his cautious defensive strategy. Cleon, a wealthy leather merchant who emerged as the leading advocate for aggressive military action, represented a new type of democratic politician who appealed directly to popular emotions rather than relying on aristocratic prestige and oratorical skill. His proposal to execute all adult male citizens of Mytilene after that city's failed revolt in 428 BC demonstrated the harsh measures that democratic assemblies could approve when driven by anger and fear. The debate revealed the moral dilemmas that imperial warfare created, how to balance justice with security, mercy with deterrence. Cleon's military leadership during the Pylos campaign of 425 BC demonstrated both his political acumen and the unpredictable nature of ancient warfare. When the Athenian general Demosthenes fortified a rocky promontory on the western coast of the Peloponnese, the resulting confrontation trapped a Spartan force on the adjacent island of Sphacteria. Cleon's boastful promise to resolve the situation within 20 days led to his appointment as co-commander, despite his lack of military experience. The subsequent Athenian victory, which captured 292 Spartan hoplites, including 120 full Spartiads, represented the most shocking military reversal in Spartan history. The psychological impact of the Sphacteria disaster extended far beyond its immediate military consequences, fundamentally altering Greek perceptions of Spartan invincibility that had persisted since the Persian Wars. The sight of Spartan warriors surrendering rather than fighting to the death contradicted the heroic mythology that had sustained Spartan prestige throughout the Greek world. For Athens, the captured Spartans provided both valuable hostages for future negotiations and powerful symbols of democratic military effectiveness that validated aggressive policies. But Sparta wasn't finished. They had a general named Brasidas who understood something crucial. You couldn't beat Athens by invading Attica. You had to strike where it really hurt. The Spartan response revealed the flexibility that characterized their strategic thinking, despite their reputation for rigid conservatism. The appointment of Brasidas as commander of operations in northern Greece represented a fundamental shift from defensive to offensive strategy designed to threaten Athenian interests in regions crucial to their imperial system. Brasidas's march through hostile territory to reach the Chalcidic Peninsula demonstrated remarkable military skill, while his diplomatic success in detaching Athenian allies revealed sophisticated understanding of the political vulnerabilities inherent in imperial systems based on coercion rather than genuine consent. The loss of Amphipolis in 424 BC represented perhaps the most serious blow to Athenian interests during the war's first phase, threatening both crucial timber supplies and the tribute revenues that sustained imperial operations. And the city's strategic location on the Strymon River controlled access to the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeus, while serving as the administrative center for Athenian interests throughout the northern Aegean. Brasidas's success in convincing the city to revolt, achieved through promises of autonomy and protection from Athenian retaliation, demonstrated the effectiveness of liberation propaganda against imperial control systems. The historian Thucydides, one of the Athenian generals responsible for the city's defense, would be exiled for this failure, and that exile would give him the time and perspective to write the greatest history of warfare ever composed. The Peace of Nicias concluded in 421 BC after 10 years of inconclusive warfare, reflected mutual exhaustion rather than decisive victory by either side. The treaty's terms, which provided for the return of captured territories and prisoners while establishing a 50-year alliance between Athens and Sparta, appeared to restore the pre-war status quo. However, the exclusion of key allies from the negotiations, particularly Corinth and the Boeotian cities that had suffered most from Athenian raids, ensured that the underlying tensions responsible for the conflict remained unresolved. The peace was fragile from the start. Both sides violated its terms almost immediately. The fragility of this peace became apparent as both sides violated its terms through support for each other's enemies in regional conflicts. The emergence of Alcibiades as a dominant figure in Athenian politics during this period introduced new levels of ambition and instability to strategic planning that would ultimately prove catastrophic for Athenian interests. The nephew of Pericles combined remarkable personal charisma with boundless political ambition and a flexible approach to moral constraints that scandalized even his contemporaries. His advocacy for aggressive expansion into new theaters of operation reflected both genuine strategic insight and personal desires for military glory that would enhance his political position. The Sicilian expedition that began in 415 BC represented the most ambitious military undertaking in Greek history, involving over 25,000 Athenian and allied personnel in an attempt to conquer the wealthy cities of Sicily and southern Italy. The expedition's official justification focused on assisting the city of Segesta against Syracuse, but the true objectives involved establishing Athenian control over the western Mediterranean's grain supplies and commercial networks. Success would have provided Athens with resources sufficient to dominate the entire Greek world while eliminating any possibility of effective resistance to imperial expansion. The scale of preparation demonstrated both Athenian wealth and the democratic assembly's capacity for approving massive resource commitments based on optimistic projections. The fleet that departed from Piraeus in June 415 BC included 134 triremes manned by over 27,000 rowers, plus transport vessels carrying 5,100 hoplites and additional light infantry, cavalry, and siege equipment. The expedition's cost, estimated at over 2,000 talents for the first year alone, exceeded the annual tribute income from the entire Delian League, while requiring additional emergency taxes on wealthy citizens. But the expedition's leadership structure reflected political compromises rather than military effectiveness. The appointment of three co-equal generals, Alcibiades, Nicias, and Lamachus, with fundamentally different strategic approaches, virtually guaranteed confusion and delay. Nicias, who had opposed the expedition from its inception, advocated for limited objectives and cautious tactics that minimized risks but also reduced prospects for decisive success. Alcibiades favored aggressive action designed to achieve rapid conquest through bold strokes that would overwhelm enemy resistance before it could organize effectively. But before the expedition could even reach Sicily, scandal struck. The Hermes, sacred statues throughout Athens, were mutilated on the eve of departure. Alcibiades was recalled to face charges. Rather than return to face trial, he fled to Sparta and gave them every secret of Athenian plans. The expedition had lost its most brilliant general and gained its most dangerous enemy. What happened next would become the greatest military disaster in Greek history. The siege of Syracuse that dominated the expedition's second year demonstrated both the potential effectiveness and ultimate limitations of Athenian military methods when applied to large-scale territorial conquest. The Athenian construction of siege walls designed to encircle the city represented sophisticated engineering that initially appeared likely to force Syracuse's surrender through starvation. However, the arrival of Spartan reinforcements under Gylippus, acting on intelligence provided by Alcibiades, enabled the defenders to complete counterwalls that prevented Athenian encirclement while opening supply lines to the interior. The siege had reversed. Now the Athenians were trapped. The transformation of the siege from an Athenian offensive operation into a desperate defensive struggle reflected the fundamental strategic miscalculations that had shaped the expedition from its inception. Rather than achieving rapid conquest through superior naval mobility and tactical skill, the Athenians found themselves trapped in a prolonged land campaign that negated their primary military advantages while exposing them to the type of infantry warfare in which their enemies excelled. The arrival of additional Syracusan allies from throughout Sicily and southern Italy gradually shifted the numerical balance against the Athenians, while their own reinforcements proved insufficient to restore offensive capabilities. Nicias's final attempt to salvage the situation through a massive night attack on the Syracusan counterwalls in 413 BC ended in complete disaster that sealed the expedition's fate. The confused fighting in darkness led to numerous friendly fire casualties while failing to achieve any of its tactical objectives. The Athenian retreat from their siege positions, conducted under constant harassment from Syracusan cavalry and light infantry, degenerated into a rout that culminated in the complete destruction of both the original expedition and the substantial reinforcements that had been sent to rescue it. The final battles at the Asinarus River represented one of the most complete military disasters in ancient history, with virtually the entire Athenian force either killed or captured during the chaotic retreat from Syracuse. The death of Nicias and the enslavement of thousands of Athenian citizens in Syracusan stone quarries symbolized the magnitude of the catastrophe while demonstrating the brutal realities of interstate warfare when conducted without restraint. The expedition's failure eliminated approximately one-third of Athens's adult male citizen population while exhausting the financial resources that had sustained imperial operations for over half a century. Prisoners who survived the initial slaughter faced conditions in the stone quarries that were almost worse than death. Exposed to the elements, given minimal food and water, worked to exhaustion, many died within weeks. Those who survived did so by reciting passages from Euripides's plays to their captors. Sicilian Greeks loved Athenian drama so much they would spare prisoners who could entertain them with speeches from the latest tragedies. It was a bizarre footnote to catastrophe, Athenian culture saving a handful of lives even as Athenian power died in Sicily. The catastrophic destruction of the Sicilian expedition had eliminated Athens as a dominant military power. But incredibly, impossibly, Athens would fight on for another 9 years. The democratic spirit that had built an empire refused to accept defeat. The question was, could sheer determination overcome impossible odds? The catastrophic destruction of the Sicilian expedition had eliminated Athens as a dominant military power while simultaneously demonstrating to the entire Greek world that even the most powerful polis could suffer complete strategic collapse through overextension and miscalculation. The loss of over 200 ships and 40,000 men represented more than a military defeat. It marked the beginning of a fundamental transformation in Greek interstate relations that would ultimately destroy the polis system's capacity for independent action. As news of the disaster reached Athens in autumn 413 BC, the immediate response revealed both the resilience and underlying fragility of democratic institutions under extreme stress. The Athenian Assembly's decision to continue the war, despite facing seemingly impossible odds, demonstrated the stubborn determination that had characterized democratic decision-making throughout the Peloponnesian conflict. Emergency measures included melting down gold and silver dedications from Acropolis temples to fund new ship construction, the liberation of slaves for naval service in exchange for citizenship, and the recall of political exiles whose military experience might prove valuable in the desperate struggle for survival. These unprecedented steps reflected the assembly's recognition that defeat would mean not merely the loss of empire, but the complete destruction of the democratic system that had defined Athenian identity for over a century. However, the oligarchic revolution of 411 BC revealed the extent to which prolonged warfare had undermined the social cohesion necessary for democratic governance. The conspiracy, led by Antiphon, Pisander, and other wealthy citizens, exploited popular frustration with military failures while promising more effective leadership through the concentration of power in fewer hands. The establishment of the Council of 400, which replaced the Democratic Assembly with an oligarchic body drawn exclusively from the wealthiest citizens, initially received support from citizens exhausted by the costs and casualties of democratic decision-making in wartime conditions. The oligarchs promised to secure Persian financial support through the restoration of Alcibiades proved illusory, as the exiled general's negotiations with Tissaphernes had been designed primarily to enhance his own bargaining position rather than genuinely assist either side. When it became clear that Persian aid would not materialize and that the oligarchy intended to make peace with Sparta on terms that would effectively end Athenian independence, the democratic forces centered around the fleet at Samos organized successful resistance that restored popular government after only 4 months of oligarchic rule. Democracy had survived, but barely. The final phase of the Peloponnesian War from 411 to 404 BC witnessed a remarkable Athenian recovery that demonstrated the continuing vitality of democratic institutions when supported by effective military leadership. The victories at Cyzicus, Abydos, and Cyzicus between 411 and 410 BC restored Athenian control over the Hellespont while eliminating much of the Spartan fleet that had threatened Athenian grain supplies from the Black Sea colonies. These successes, achieved through the tactical innovations of commanders like Alcibiades and Thrasybulus, proved that Athenian naval supremacy could still be decisive when properly coordinated with strategic objectives. The Athenians were winning again. Against all odds, they were winning, but their own democratic institutions were about to commit an act of self-destruction that would snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. The Battle of Arginusae in 406 BC represented both the pinnacle of this democratic resurgence and the beginning of its ultimate collapse through internal political conflicts. The Athenian fleet of 150 triremes, manned largely by hastily trained crews, including slaves promised freedom for their service, defeated a Spartan force of 120 ships while killing the enemy, Admiral Callicratidas, and capturing or destroying over 70 vessels. This victory eliminated the immediate threat to Athenian communications with their remaining allies, while demonstrating that democratic motivation could still overcome professional military advantages when circumstances favored Athenian tactical strengths. Yet the aftermath of Arginusae revealed the destructive potential of democratic decision-making when driven by emotional responses rather than rational analysis. The failure to rescue survivors from damaged Athenian ships caused by a sudden storm that prevented the designated rescue vessels from reaching the battle site created public outrage that the assembly channeled against the victorious generals. Trial and execution of 6 of the 8 commanders, including Pericles' son, eliminated Athens' most experienced naval leaders while demonstrating to potential successors the personal risks involved in accepting military responsibility during democratic governance. Athens had just killed its best generals for winning a battle. The madness of it was staggering. This self-destructive tendency reached its climax at Aegospotami in 405 BC, where the inexperienced commanders who had replaced the executed generals allowed Lysander to destroy virtually the entire remaining Athenian fleet through a surprise attack on beached vessels. The disaster occurred because the new Athenian commanders ignored basic security precautions while their crews dispersed to forage for food. creating an opportunity that the Spartan admiral exploited with devastating effectiveness. The loss of 160 triremes and their crews eliminated Athens's capacity for continued naval operations, while exposing the city to complete blockade by enemy forces. The siege of Athens during the winter of 405–404 BC demonstrated both the effectiveness of Spartan strategic planning under Lysander's direction and the ultimate dependence of imperial systems on continued military success. The Spartan blockade of Piraeus, combined with the occupation of Decelia that prevented agricultural production in Attica, created famine conditions that forced the Athenian assembly to accept unconditional surrender. The demolition of the long walls to the sound of flute music, as reported by contemporary sources, symbolized the end of the imperial system that had dominated the Aegean for over half a century. The Spartan victory in 404 BC established a hegemonic system that differed fundamentally from Athenian imperialism in its methods and objectives, yet proved equally unstable in its long-term consequences. Lysander's installation of oligarchic governments throughout the former Athenian Empire, supported by Spartan garrisons and local collaborators, aimed at creating a network of dependent allies rather than tribute-paying subjects. In Athens itself, the 30 tyrants led by Critias implemented a reign of terror that eliminated over 1,500 citizens while confiscating property to reward supporters. But the democratic spirit wasn't dead. In 403 BC, democratic exiles under Thrasybulus would return, overthrow the 30 tyrants, and restore democracy. Athens had lost its empire, it had lost the war, but it had kept its soul. The democratic restoration led by Thrasybulus in 403 BC revealed both the continuing appeal of popular government and the limitations of Spartan military resources for maintaining control over unwilling populations. The initial force of only 70 exiles who occupied Phyle, a fortress in the mountains northeast of Athens, grew rapidly as citizens fled the capital to escape oligarchic persecution. King Pausanias's decision to negotiate a compromise settlement that restored democratic government while granting amnesty to most oligarchic collaborators reflected growing Spartan concerns about the costs of maintaining imperial control through military occupation. The broader challenges facing Spartan hegemony became apparent as similar resistance movements emerged throughout the former Athenian Empire. The Spartan attempt to extend their control into Asia Minor through campaigns against Persian territories brought them into conflict with Artaxerxes II, who responded by providing financial support to anti-Spartan coalitions within Greece itself. The Persian strategy of using Greek mercenaries and subsidies to maintain a balance of power that prevented any single Greek state from achieving lasting dominance proved remarkably effective in exploiting the competitive dynamics that characterized interstate relations. The Corinthian War that began in 395 BC marked the first major challenge to Spartan hegemony from a coalition that included Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, supported by substantial Persian financial assistance. The conflict's origins lay in Spartan interference in local disputes that violated the autonomy principles supposedly guaranteed by the hegemonic system. The Battle of Haliartus in 395 BC, where the Spartan general Lysander was killed during an unsuccessful assault on the Boeotian city, demonstrated that Spartan military supremacy was not invincible when facing determined resistance supported by adequate resources. The final defeat of the anti-Spartan coalition and the subsequent peace settlements demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of Persian diplomacy in preventing Greek unification. But the most dramatic challenge to traditional assumptions about Greek military capabilities came not from Persia, but from Thebes. The Theban sacred band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of lovers organized by Epaminondas and Pelopidas around 378 BC, revolutionized infantry tactics through innovations that would influence military development throughout the Hellenistic period. The unit's organization around homosexual partnerships based on the theory that lovers would fight more fiercely to protect each other than ordinary soldiers motivated by abstract patriotic duty created unprecedented levels of unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. The liberation of Messenia following the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC represented the most dramatic reversal of fortune in Greek military history, transforming Sparta from the dominant land power into a minor regional state within a single campaign season. The Theban victory, achieved through the tactical innovations of Epaminondas and the disciplined fighting of the Sacred Band, killed over 1,000 Spartans, including King Cleombrotus, while demonstrating the vulnerability of traditional phalanx formations to innovative tactical approaches. The psychological impact of this defeat shattered the aura of Spartan invincibility that had dominated Greek military thinking since the Persian Wars. Sparta, the state that had terrified Greece for 2 centuries, had been broken. The Helots were freed. Messenia was independent. Sparta would never recover. But Greek freedom wouldn't last much longer either, because from the north, a new power was rising that would make all Greek conflicts irrelevant. The rise of Macedon under Philip II during the 360s and 350s BC initially appeared to represent simply another example of peripheral kingdom expansion that had occasionally disrupted Greek politics without fundamentally altering the polis system's basic structure. Philip's accession to the throne in 359 BC as regent for his infant nephew Amyntas IV seemed unlikely to change this pattern, particularly given the military pressures from Illyrian tribes and the political instability that had characterized recent Macedonian history. But Philip's military reforms and territorial expansion during the 350s BC created a new type of state that combined Greek military techniques with Macedonian social organization and Persian administrative methods. The development of the Macedonian phalanx, which extended the traditional hoplite formation through the use of longer spears called sarissas and deeper formations of up to 16 ranks, created tactical advantages that proved decisive against traditional Greek infantry. The sarissa's length of approximately 18 feet enabled Macedonian phalangites to engage enemy formations before traditional 8-foot spears could reach them, while the deeper formations provided greater staying power in prolonged combat. The integration of cavalry, light infantry, and siege equipment into coordinated tactical systems gave Philip's armies capabilities that no traditional Greek polis could match through citizen soldier levies. The companion cavalry, recruited from Macedonian nobility and equipped with long lances for shock combat, provided the mobile striking power necessary for exploiting gaps created by phalanx attacks. The development of sophisticated siege equipment, including torsion catapults and mobile towers, enabled Macedonian forces to reduce fortified cities that had previously been immune to assault through traditional hoplite tactics. Philip's intervention in the Third Sacred War provided the opportunity for extending Macedonian influence into central Greece while demonstrating the military effectiveness of his reformed army against traditional Greek opponents. The Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC marked the decisive moment when Greek independence ended and Macedonian hegemony began. Philip's army, including the 18-year-old Alexander commanding the companion cavalry, faced a combined Greek force including Athenians and Thebans. The battle demonstrated the superiority of Macedonian military organization, the coordinated use of phalanx and cavalry, the disciplined tactical movements, the professional training that citizen soldier armies couldn't match. The Theban Sacred Band, which had dominated Greek warfare for decades, was annihilated to the last man. They died in place, lovers falling beside lovers, refusing to retreat even when the battle was obviously lost. The aftermath of Chaeronea saw Philip establish the League of Corinth, which formalized Macedonian control over Greece while maintaining the fiction of Greek autonomy. All Greek states except Sparta joined, swearing oaths to Philip and his descendants. The League's stated purpose was to prepare for a united Greek campaign against Persia, revenge for Xerxes' invasion 140 years earlier. But before Philip could launch that campaign, he was assassinated at his daughter's wedding in 336 BC. The 20-year-old Alexander inherited his father's kingdom, his army, and his ambitions. But Alexander's ambitions would prove far greater than his father's. Philip had dreamed of conquering Persian territories in Asia Minor. Alexander would conquer the entire known world. Alexander's response to the challenges facing him demonstrated both the military genius inherited from his father and the unprecedented ambition that would transform the ancient world within a single generation. The consolidation of power following Philip's assassination required swift action against multiple threats. Alexander's execution of potential rival claimants eliminated domestic challenges while demonstrating the ruthlessness that would characterize his treatment of opposition throughout his career. The Greek revolt that erupted immediately after Philip's death tested Alexander's capacity for managing complex political relationships. The Theban revolt of 335 BC provided Alexander with the opportunity to establish his reputation for decisive action. The systematic destruction of Thebes, accomplished through 3 days of methodical demolition that left only temples and the house of the poet Pindar standing, created shock throughout the Greek world while establishing Alexander's reputation for combining military effectiveness with cultural sensitivity. The enslavement of the surviving population, Psyche, numbering approximately 30,000 individuals, provided both practical benefits through slave sales and symbolic demonstration of the costs of resistance. The decision to spare Athens, despite that city's support for the revolt, demonstrated Alexander's sophisticated understanding of political calculations necessary for maintaining Greek cooperation during his planned Persian campaign. The invasion of the Persian Empire in 334 BC represented the culmination of plans that Philip had developed, but also reflected Alexander's personal ambitions that extended far beyond his father's more limited objectives. The army that crossed the Hellespont in spring 334 BC reflected both Macedonian military innovations and the diverse human resources available through his father's conquests and alliances. The victories at Granicus River, Issus, and Gaugamela demonstrated Alexander's tactical brilliance, while the conquests of Egypt and the entire Persian Empire showed his strategic vision. But we don't have time for the full story of Alexander's conquests. That would require another script entirely. What matters for Greek history is this. Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BC created an immediate succession crisis that would fundamentally reshape the ancient world. The empire that had stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River would fragment into competing kingdoms whose rulers would spend decades fighting each other while simultaneously attempting to preserve and adapt the Hellenistic culture that Alexander's conquests had created. The Diadochi, the successors, would carve up Alexander's empire into new kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, Antigonid Macedonia. These Hellenistic kingdoms spread Greek culture throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, creating a cosmopolitan civilization that blended Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and other traditions. Alexandria in Egypt became the intellectual center of this new world, with its famous library and museum attracting scholars from across the known world. Euclid systematized geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference, Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system. Greek became the common language of educated elites from Italy to India. But this Hellenistic world, for all its cultural achievements, had lost something essential: Greek political independence. The polis system that had created democracy, philosophy, and classical culture was dying, and from the West, a new power was rising that would finish what Alexander had begun: Rome. The gradual Roman intervention in Greek affairs during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC occurred initially through defensive alliances and limited territorial objectives, but eventually evolved into systematic conquest that eliminated Hellenistic independence. The Macedonian Wars demonstrated Roman military superiority over traditional Greek tactical systems. The Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BC showed that Roman legions could defeat Macedonian phalanxes through superior tactical flexibility. The Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, where Lucius Aemilius Paulus achieved perhaps the most complete victory in Roman military history against Perseus, the last Antigonid king of Macedonia, marked the effective end of Greek military independence. The final destruction of the Achaean League in 146 BC, accomplished through Lucius Mummius's systematic devastation of Corinth, marked the end of meaningful Greek independence and the beginning of direct Roman provincial administration. The sack of Corinth represented more than military victory. It marked the definitive end of Greek political independence and the beginning of a new era in which Greek culture would survive and flourish under Roman patronage, while Greek political institutions withered under imperial administration. The systematic destruction of Corinth's buildings, the slaughter of its male population, and the enslavement of women and children served as brutal demonstration to any remaining Greek communities that resistance to Roman authority would result in complete annihilation. Transformation of Greece into the Roman province of Achaea completed the process of conquest that had begun with defensive alliances and evolved into systematic territorial annexation. Thus ended the remarkable journey of ancient Greek civilization from its humble beginnings in the Bronze Age Aegean through the classical flowering of the polis system to the cosmopolitan achievements of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The Roman conquest of 146 BC marked not the death of Greek culture, but its transformation into new forms that would continue to influence Western civilization for millennia to come. The political independence that had defined Greek identity since the Dark Ages was lost forever. But the intellectual, artistic, and cultural achievements that had made Greek civilization distinctive survived to enrich the broader Mediterranean world under Roman imperial unity. In losing their political freedom, the Greeks had gained a form of cultural immortality that would outlast all the empires that conquered them. Greek philosophy would shape Christian theology. Greek art would define Western aesthetic standards for 2,000 years. Greek political concepts, democracy, citizenship, the rule of law, would inspire revolutions and constitutions throughout modern history. The Spartans at Thermopylae, the Athenians at Marathon, the philosophers in the Agora, the playwrights in the theatre, the athletes at Olympia, all of them are still with us, still influencing how we think about courage, freedom, justice, beauty, and truth. Ancient Greece fell to Rome. But in a very real sense, Greece never died. It just changed form from independent poli to cultural legacy, from political power to intellectual influence. Every democracy in the modern world owes something to Athens. Every republic owes something to Greek political philosophy. Every scientific inquiry owes something to Greek rationalism. The journey from Minoan Crete to Roman Achaea lasted over 2,500 years. But the journey of Greek ideas, that's still ongoing. If this epic journey through Greek history has moved you, please subscribe to Flow of History, because understanding where our ideas about freedom, democracy, and citizenship came from helps us protect them today.